Welcome to True Crime Cases, where we delve into the darkest corners of human nature. Today's episode unravels a tale of wife murdered after discovering husband's secret life in tragic murder. In the picturesque town of Willowbrook, nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York, life seemed to move at a gentler pace than the bustling cities just a few hours south. Tree-lined streets boasted beautiful Victorian homes, their wrap-around porches inviting neighbors to sit and chat on warm summer evenings. At the heart of this idyllic community stood the Carson family home, a stunning, three-case Queen Anne-style house that was the envy of the neighborhood. The Carsons were the epitome of the American dream. Richard Carson, 46, was the CEO of a successful tech startup that had recently gone public, making him one of the wealthiest residents in Willowbrook. His wife, Deborah Carson, 43, was a beloved high school English teacher, known for her passion for literature and her ability to inspire even the most reluctant student. Their children, Mason, 17, and Cheryl, 14, were bright, well-mannered, and active in various school and community activities. To their friends and neighbors, the Carsons appeared to have it all. Richard was admired for his business acumen and his generous contributions to local charities. His salt and pepper hair and striking blue eyes gave him a distinguished appearance, commanding respect in both boardrooms and social gatherings. Deborah, with her warm brown eyes and contagious laugh, was a favorite among her students and colleagues. Her long chestnut hair and elegant style made her stand out at school functions and town events. Carson children were equally impressive. Mason was a star athlete on the school's lacrosse team and had his sights set on an Ivy League education. Cheryl was a gifted artist, her paintings already garnering attention from local galleries. The family was active in the community, regularly volunteering at the local animal shelter and organizing fundraisers for the town's historical society. However, beneath this veneer of perfection, a storm was brewing that would soon shatter the illusion of the Carsons' idyllic life and send shockwaves through the tight-knit community of Willowbrook. The morning of June 15, 2024, began like any other in the Carson household. Deborah woke early to prepare breakfast for the family before heading to school for a faculty meeting. Richard, having just returned from a late-night conference call with investors in Asia, was still asleep. Children were getting ready for their last week of school before summer break, their voices drifting down from the upper floors of the house. As Deborah moved about the kitchen, her mind was preoccupied with thoughts that had been troubling her for weeks. She had noticed changes in Richard's behavior, increased secrecy around his phone and laptop, unexplained absences, and a growing emotional distance. At first, she had attributed it to the stress of running a newly public company, but a nagging suspicion had taken root in her mind. The previous evening, while Richard was on his conference call, Deborah had made a discovery that turned her world upside down. While searching for a misplaced document on Richard's laptop, she had stumbled upon a hidden folder. What she found inside made her blood run cold. There were emails detailing an extramarital affair, financial records showing large transfers to offshore accounts, and most disturbingly, evidence of illegal activities within his company. Deborah's discovery had left her reeling. She had always believed her marriage to be built on a foundation of trust and mutual respect. Now she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about the man she had been married to for 20 years. As she poured coffee into Richard's favorite mug, a gift from Mason and Cheryl on Father's Day, Deborah had made a decision. She couldn't continue living with this uncertainty and betrayal. Today, after the children left for school, she would confront Richard about her discovery and demand answers. Little did she know that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. The day progressed with an air of normalcy that belied the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. Mason and Cheryl left for school, their backpacks filled with books and anticipation for the upcoming summer break. Richard woke late, rushing through breakfast before heading to the office for an important board meeting. Deborah attended her faculty meeting, her professional demeanor masking the emotional storm raging within her. As evening approached, tension began to build in the Carson home. Mason was at lacrosse practice, and Cheryl was attending an art club meeting. The house was unusually quiet as Deborah waited for Richard to return from work. She had sent their housekeeper Rosa home early, wanting privacy for the confrontation to come. When Richard's Tesla finally pulled into the driveway at 7:45 p.m., Deborah's heart began to race. She watched from the living room window as he exited the vehicle, his movements confident and relaxed. For a moment, she felt a pang of sadness for the life they had built together, now on the brink of destruction. But then she remembered the emails, the financial records, the lies, and her resolve hardened. Richard entered the house, calling out a cheerful greeting as he hung up his coat. He found Deborah in the living room, a glass of white wine in her hand and a serious expression on her face. The atmosphere in the room immediately shifted, tension crackling in the air between them. What transpired next would become the subject of intense speculation and investigation in the weeks to come. Neighbors would later report hearing raised voices, the sound of breaking glass, and then an eerie silence. But in Willowbrook, where privacy was highly valued and neighborly intervention was seen as intrusive, no one called the police. The following morning, when Deborah failed to show up for her first period class, her colleague and close friend, Sarah Thompson, became concerned. It was completely out of character for Deborah to miss school without notice, especially during the last week before summer break. After several unanswered calls and text messages, Sarah decided to stop by the Carson residence on her way to school. As Sarah pulled up to the Grand Victorian house, she noticed both Richard and Deborah's cars in the driveway. An uneasy feeling settled in her stomach as she approached the front door. She rang the doorbell. There was no answer. After several attempts, Sarah tried the door handle and was surprised to find it unlocked. The scene that greeted Sarah as she entered the Carson home would haunt her for years to come. The usually immaculate living room was in disarray, with overturned furniture and shattered picture frames strewn across the floor, and there, amidst the chaos, lay Deborah Carson. Sarah's scream pierced the quiet morning air of Willowbrook. She rushed to Deborah's side, but it was immediately clear that her friend and colleague was beyond help. The once vibrant and inspiring teacher lay still, her warm brown eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Multiple bruises marred her body, and a pool of blood had seeped into the antique Persian rug beneath her. With shaking hands, Dara called 911. Within minutes, the peaceful streets of Willowbrook were filled with the wailing of sirens, as police cars and ambulances converged on the Carson home. Neighbors gathered on their perfectly manicured lawns, watching in shock as crime scene tape went up and detectives began to arrive. Detective Michael Rodriguez, a veteran investigator with the New York State Police, took charge of the scene. As he surveyed the crime scene, his trained eye picked up on several key details. The lack of forced entry suggested Deborah knew her attacker. The violence of the assault pointed to a crime of passion rather than a premeditated act, and the absence of Richard Carson immediately raised red flags. As forensics teams combed through the house, collecting evidence and taking photographs, Detective Rodriguez began interviewing neighbors and friends. A picture started to emerge of a couple that, while outwardly perfect, had been showing signs of strain in recent weeks. Margaret Sullivan, the Carsons' next-door neighbor, recalled hearing an argument late the previous night. "I've never heard them fight like that before," she told Detective Rodriguez. "Deborah was shouting something about betrayal and lies. I almost called the police, but then it got quiet. I assumed they'd worked things out." Other neighbors reported similar observations. James Watkins, who lived across the street, mentioned seeing Richard leave the house in a hurry around midnight, carrying a large duffel bag. "I thought it was strange," he said, "but Richard often took late-night flights for business, though I didn't think too much of it at the time." As the investigation progressed, the search for Richard Carson intensified. His credit cards had been used to purchase a plane ticket to the Cayman Islands, but security camera footage from Albany International Airport showed he never boarded the flight. It was a classic misdirection, leaving investigators to wonder where he had really gone. The Carson children, Mason and Cheryl, were brought home from school by their maternal grandmother, Eleanor Thompson. The sight of their family home, surrounded by police cars and curious onlookers, was devastating for the teenagers. Detective Rodriguez approached them gently, knowing that while they might have crucial information, their well-being had to come first. Eleanor Thompson, shocked and grief-stricken, struggled to comprehend what had happened. Richard and Deborah were the perfect couple, she insisted, tears streaming down her face. There must be some mistake. Richard would never hurt Deborah. Never. But as the investigation deepened, cracks in the facade of the Carsons' perfect life began to show. Financial records revealed discrepancies that hinted at hidden accounts and unexplained income. Interviews with Richard's colleagues at his tech company painted a picture of a man who was brilliant, but increasingly paranoid and secretive. One of Richard's employees, a software engineer named Alex Chen, reluctantly shared information that would prove crucial to the investigation. Richard had been acting strange lately. Alex admitted, his eyes downcast. He would have us work on projects that didn't seem to align with our company's goals. When I questioned him about it, he became defensive and threatened to fire me. I didn't want to lose my job, so I kept quiet. As days turned into weeks, the case captivated not just Willowbrook, but the entire state of New York. Local and national news stations ran nightly updates on the search for Richard Carson, and true crime enthusiasts across the country followed the case with morbid fascination. The Carson children, meanwhile, were caught in a maelstrom of confusion and grief. Mason, old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, became withdrawn and angry. Cheryl, struggling to comprehend the loss of her mother and the disappearance of her father, retreated into her art, creating dark and haunting paintings that reflected her inner turmoil. Eleanor Thompson did her best to shield her grandchildren from the media frenzy and the whispers of the neighbors that the weight of the tragedy was inescapable. The once bright futures of Mason and Cheryl now seemed uncertain, overshadowed by the dark cloud of their family's destruction. 4 weeks after Deborah's murder, a breakthrough finally came. A facial recognition hit from a surveillance camera placed Richard Carson in Montreal, Canada. The international manhunt that followed involved cooperation between U.S. and Canadian law enforcement agencies. Richard was finally apprehended trying to board a private yacht bound for international waters. When cornered, the man who had once been the pride of Willowbrook, haggard and defeated. He offered no resistance as Canadian authorities took him into custody. The extradition process was expedited. Within days, Richard Carson was back on U.S. soil, facing charges for the murder of his wife. As he was led into the Albany courthouse, a crowd of reporters and angry onlookers hurled questions and insult. The man who had once been revered as a business genius and philanthropist was now reviled as a murderer. As the legal process unfolded, the full extent of Richard's double life came to light. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man living two completely separate existences. By day, he was the successful CEO and devoted family man. By night, he was deeply involved in a web of corporate fraud, money laundering, and infidelity that spanned the globe. Prosecution theorized that when Deborah confronted Richard with her discovery of his hidden activities, he realized his carefully constructed world was about to crumble. In a moment of panic and rage, he had lashed out, silencing the one person who could expose his lies. Richard's defense team attempted to paint Deborah's death as a tragic accident, result of a heated argument that had spiraled out of control. But the evidence was overwhelming. The brutality of the attack, Richard's attempted flight, and the mountain of evidence pointing to his secret life left little room for doubt. After a highly publicized trial that lasted 6 weeks, the jury took less than 10 hours to reach a verdict. Richard Carson was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Richard was led away from the courtroom, Deborah's parents, Eleanor and George Thompson, held each other, tears streaming down their faces. They had lost a daughter, and now watched as the man they had welcomed into their family was condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars. The aftermath of the trial left the community of Willowbrook reeling. A place that had once seemed like a safe haven now felt tainted. Neighbors looked at each other with suspicion, wondering what secrets might be hiding behind other perfectly manicured lawns and gleaming luxury. For Mason and Cheryl Carson, road ahead was long and difficult. They had lost both parents in the most traumatic way possible. Eleanor and George Thompson took custody of their grandchildren, vowing to give them as normal a life as possible despite the circumstance. The Carson home, once the jewel of Willowbrook, stood empty, a silent reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Eventually, it was sold, the new owners eager to erase all traces of its dark history. In the years that followed, Willowbrook slowly began to heal. The case of Deborah and Richard Carson became a cautionary tale, a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that even in the most affluent and seemingly perfect communities, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface. Deborah's colleagues at Willowbrook High School established a scholarship fund in her name, dedicated to supporting students who wanted to pursue careers in education. The annual Deborah Carson Memorial 5K Run became a major event in the town, raising funds and awareness for domestic violence prevention. Richard Carson, meanwhile, faded into obscurity behind prison walls. A man who had once commanded respect and admiration was now just another inmate, his days filled with regret and the knowledge of the lives he had destroyed. As for Mason and Cheryl, they grew up under the loving care of their grandparent. They faced challenges, attending therapy, and learning to navigate a world forever changed by their parents' actions. But they also found strength in each other and in the memories of their mother's love. Mason, driven by a desire to make a positive impact in the world, eventually pursued a career in environmental law. He dedicated his life to holding corporations accountable for their actions, ensuring that others wouldn't suffer as his family had due to corporate greed and deceit. Cheryl found solace in her art, her talent evolving into a profound ability to capture complex emotions on canvas. Her paintings, often exploring themes of loss, redemption, and resilience, gained recognition in the art world. She used her platform to raise awareness about the impact of domestic violence on children and families. The case of Deborah Carson's murder served as a wake-up call for many. It sparked conversations about the nature of trust, the secrets we keep, and the importance of looking beyond the surface of seemingly perfect lives. In Willowbrook and beyond, people began to question the value they placed on appearances, recognizing that true happiness and security come from genuine connections and honesty. Years later, Detective Michael Rodriguez would reflect on the case that had changed his career and his perspective on human nature. The Carson case taught me that you can never really know what's going on behind closed doors, he mused. It's a reminder to be vigilant, to look out for one another, to never take relationships for granted. As time passed, the shock of the Carson tragedy faded. Its impact lingered. Willowbrook would never be quite the same idyllic town it once was. But perhaps, in losing its innocence, the community had gained something valuable, a deeper understanding of the complexities of human nature and the importance of genuine connections over superficial perfection. The case of Deborah and Richard Carson became more than just a sensational true crime tale. It became a part of the fabric of Willowbrook, a somber reminder woven into the town's history. It served as a lesson that even in the most picture-perfect settings, the darkest of secrets can hide, waiting to be uncovered. In the end, the tragedy of Deborah Carson's murder left an indelible mark on all who were touched by it. It was a stark reminder that life can change in an instant, that trust is precious and fragile, and that the facades we present to the world may hide truths we never imagined. The quiet streets of Willowbrook would never forget the summer when their peaceful existence was shattered, and a community learned that sometimes the greatest dangers lie not in the unknown, but in what we think we know all too well. The Carson case also had far-reaching implications beyond Willowbrook. It sparked a national conversation about domestic violence in affluent communities, challenging the misconception that such issues only affected lower-income families. Social workers and domestic violence advocates used the case to highlight the need for increased awareness and resources in all socioeconomic brackets. In the business world, the revelation of Richard Carson's fraudulent activities led to increased scrutiny of tech startups and their financial practices. The Securities and Exchange Commission implemented stricter regulations and oversight measures, particularly for companies preparing to go public. the tragedy also had a profound impact on the education system. Deborah's dedication to her students and her untimely death prompted a re-evaluation of support systems for teachers. Schools across the state began implementing mental health programs and counseling services for educators, recognizing the often overlooked stress and emotional burden they carry. In Willowbrook High School, Deborah's former classroom became a memorial of sorts. Her students, past and present, covered the walls with notes of remembrance and gratitude. The school board decided to keep the room as a study hall and quiet reflection space, ensuring that Deborah's spirit of learning and inspiration lived on. As the years passed, the Carson children's journey continued to captivate the public's attention. Mason's path to becoming an environmental lawyer was not without its challenges. The shadow of his father's crimes initially made it difficult for him to gain trust in the legal community. However, his unwavering dedication to justice and his personal case of overcoming adversity eventually earned him respect and admiration. Cheryl's artistic career blossomed in unexpected ways. Her early works, dark and haunting reflections of her trauma, evolved into powerful statements on resilience and hope. A series of her paintings titled Shattered Reflections toured major galleries across the country, sparking conversations about the long-term effects of domestic violence on children. Carson case also became a subject of academic study. Universities incorporated it into their criminology, psychology, and sociology curricula. Researchers examined the case from various angles: the psychology of white-collar crime, impact of trauma on families, and the role of community in both perpetuating and healing from tragedy. In Willowbrook, the aftermath of the Carson tragedy led to a reimagining of community dynamic. Town, once priding itself on its privacy and non-interference, began to foster a culture of genuine connection and support. Annual block parties, community forums, and support groups sprang up, encouraging neighbors to look out for one another in meaningful ways. The tech company that Richard Carson had built and nearly destroyed underwent a complete transformation. Under new leadership, it rebranded itself and redirected its focus towards developing software for non-profit organizations. Company's new mission statement, Technology for Transparency, was a direct response to the secrecy and fraud that had nearly been its undoing. Eleanor and George Thompson, who had taken on the unexpected role of raising their teenage grandchildren, became advocates for grandparents' rights and support. They started a support group for grandparents raising grandchildren due to tragic circumstances, which quickly spread to neighboring towns and eventually became a statewide network. Detective Michael Rodriguez, deeply affected by the Carson case, became a sought-after speaker on domestic violence awareness. He traveled to police departments across the country, sharing insights from the case and emphasizing the importance of looking beyond appearances in domestic disturbance calls. The media's role in the Carson case also came under scrutiny. Journalism schools used the coverage as a case study in responsible reporting on domestic violence and white-collar crime. The intense public interest in the case sparked debates about the fine line between informing the public and sensationalizing tragedy. In the legal world, Carson trial set precedents for cases involving a combination of domestic violence and white-collar crime. Prosecutors and defense attorneys alike studied the case, recognizing the complex intersections of personal and professional misconduct. As Mason and Cheryl entered adulthood, they faced the challenging task of building their own families in the shadow of their parents' tragedy. Mason, wary of repeating his father's mistakes, approached relationships with caution and transparency. Cheryl, through her art and therapy, worked through her trust issues, eventually finding a partner who understood and supported her journey. On the 10th anniversary of Deborah's death, Willowbrook held a town-wide commemoration. The event, while somber, focused on celebrating Deborah's life and the positive changes that had emerged from the tragedy. Mason and Cheryl, now in their late 20s, spoke publicly for the first time about their experience, their words a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The Carson home, which had stood empty for years after the tragedy, was eventually repurposed. A group of local investors, inspired by Deborah's legacy, transformed it into a community center focused on education and family support services. The Deborah Carson Learning Center became a beacon of hope, offering tutoring, counseling, and workshops for families in need. In prison, Richard Carson's life took an unexpected turn. Initially unrepentant, the reality of his actions slowly began to sink in over the years. He started writing a journal, which eventually turned into a memoir. The book, published under the title Price of Perfection, offered a raw and unflinching look at the mindset that had led him to commit his crimes. While some criticized the publication as an attempt to profit from tragedy, others found value in its cautionary message. The ripple effects of the Carson case continued to be felt in subtle ways throughout society. Companies began placing greater emphasis on work-life balance, recognizing how the pressure to maintain a perfect facade had contributed to Richard's downward spiral. Schools implemented programs to teach students about healthy relationships and the dangers of keeping secret. In the world of true crime, the Carson case remained a topic of fascination. Documentaries, podcasts, and books continued to explore the case from various angles, each adding new perspectives to the tragic case. However, those who knew Deborah and the Carson children personally were careful to remind the public that behind the sensational headlines were real people, still healing and trying to move forward. As Willowbrook approached the 20th anniversary of the tragedy, the town had transformed in many ways. The perfect facades were less immaculate, but the community bonds were stronger. People had learned to value authenticity over appearance and to reach out to neighbors in need, rather than looking the other way. Mason Carson, now a prominent environmental lawyer, returned to Willowbrook with his own family. In a poignant moment, he bought back his childhood home from the community center. Instead of moving in, however, he donated it to the town permanently, ensuring that the Deborah Carson Learning Center would continue its vital work for generations to come. Cheryl Carson's art continued to evolve, her later works exploring themes of forgiveness and healing. A piece titled Reflections of Grace, featuring abstract representations of her family, including her father, was acquired by the National Gallery of Art, testament to her journey and her ability to transform pain into beauty. Carson case, once a shocking anomaly, became a part of Willowbrook's identity. It was a reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors, but also of the light that can emerge from even the deepest tragedy. The town's ability to heal, to learn, and to grow from the experience became a model for other communities facing their own challenges. As the sun set on another day in Willowbrook, the town stood as a testament to the complexity of human nature, the strength of community, and the enduring power of hope. Tragedy that had once threatened to tear it apart had in many ways brought it closer together. The legacy of Deborah Carson, a teacher whose final lesson was perhaps her most profound, continued to shape the town and its people, reminder that from great darkness can come great light. Case of the Carson family, of Willowbrook, and of all those touched by the events of that fateful summer, serves as a powerful reminder. It reminds us to look beyond the surface, to value genuine connections over perfect appearances, and to never take for granted the relationships we hold dear. For in the end, it is not the facade we present to the world that defines us, but the truth of who we are and how we treat those around us.